Hello and welcome to Postgres FM, a weekly show about all things PostgreSQL. I am Michael, founder of PG Mustard, and today I am not joined by Nikolai. He is finally taking a well-earned break. So this week you've just got me. I am in the process of getting a couple of guests as well, which I'm excited about. So hopefully for the next couple of weeks we'll be able to give you those conversations. But in the meantime, I'm going to record an episode on pretty much the only topic I feel comfortable sharing knowledge on my own, which is Explain. And due to the nature of the product I've been working on for the past few years, I have spent a lot of time looking at Explain plans and helping folks with those. So yeah, I've given a couple of talks on this in the past, but I realized we hadn't actually done a podcast episode on it. We've done a few related ones, so long-term listeners will be familiar with some of the things we've talked about previously, but we haven't done an intro level one, or even I have a process I'd like to recommend people use. Haven't discussed that yet, so I'm hoping to give you a couple of those things. But on the topic of guests, before I move on, if you have any recommendations or requests on either the guest front or the topic front, those are always welcome. Please send those to us, either privately or publicly. They would be very, very welcome. So Explain. First, what is Explain and what does it do? So Explain is a statement that you put in front of your query, and Postgres will return the query execution plan. So by default, you just get the plan. So what Postgres would do, what choices it would make to execute that query. It doesn't execute the query if you just use Explain, and it provides back the estimated costs involved. So you might have heard that Postgres has a cost-based optimizer. This gives you some insight into the costs that it's calculating and why it's making certain choices. So why it's choosing a certain scan type over another certain scan type, or the join order it's chosen, or the join type it's doing for a specific join. So all of those are based on what's possible and also what it thinks will be fastest. Now, the costs are in an arbitrary unit, but the idea is the lower the cost, the faster the optimizer thinks it would be. So it is correlated to time, but they're not in a unit of time. So Explain on its own can be useful to quickly see, for example, if you have a query that's timing out or taking absolutely ages, you can quickly have a look at the query plan and just check maybe why it might be slow. But if we want to know for sure why a query is slow and it's executing in a reasonable amount of time, chances are we're going to want to use some Explain parameters to not just get the plan back, but also run the query behind the scenes and get execution statistics. So the most common of those parameters that you might have heard alongside Explain is analyze. And this is different to the analyze keyword for getting query statistics. This is Explain analyze specifically. But there are loads more parameters as well. In fact, we did a whole episode on why we believe, or Nikolai and I believe, that buffers should be on by default with analyze. So buffers is another parameter that gives you extra runtime or execution statistics alongside the timings that you get with analyze. So with buffers, we also get information about the blocks read, written. So the amount of work being done by the query, not just the timings. So that can really help. But there are a bunch of other parameters as well. I like to recommend people use as many of them as they can. Most of them don't have that much additional overhead. Analyze can. In fact, that's something worth bearing in mind, that there are a couple of caveats when it comes to Explain analyze. It can both over-report and under-report the amount of time that a query would take in the wild. So, for example, it's been referred to as the observer effect before, but if we have a slow system clock, the overhead of checking the timings can add a significant overhead to the total execution time when we're running Explain with analyze on, and with time, specifically with timings on. So that's how it can over-report. That's the easiest way it can over-report on the execution time. But it can also under-report if you, for example, when we're running explain analyze, Postgres doesn't have to transmit the data to us. So if we're requesting thousands of rows and we're not close to the database, so perhaps it's a user doing a big report from a different continent than that the database is on, your monitoring might be showing that query is taking a few seconds to execute, whereas maybe explain analyze would report it only taking a few hundred milliseconds, because it doesn't have to transmit that data across the network. So it can overreport and underreport, but generally that's pretty uncommon and also directionally you'll still see where the slowest parts of that query plan are, even if the numbers aren't precise. So those are the caveats. In terms of the process I recommend, the number one, I think I've mentioned it before in the podcast, but it's so important, it's worth repeating. You need to be running on a realistic size data set to get realistic performance data. Now, it doesn't have to be the exact same data. The important part is the number of rows. So, for example, if you were testing out a new feature and your local data set only has a couple of dozen rows, but production has a few million, chances are that the Postgres planner is going to be making different choices on join order or join algorithm, even scan type. So it could even choose to do a sequential scan if your data is small enough, even if there is a good index available. So that can really surprise people, but it's really important. As the data sets get bigger, this becomes slightly less important. So if you're testing on tens of millions of rows instead of hundreds of millions, there's less of a chance of an issue, but still a chance of an issue, getting a different plan. So very much worth bearing that in mind. If you can test on a realistic size data set, please do. There's lots of tools available for doing that and for masking data these days. But that's, in fact, I think we've done it. If we've done an episode on that, I think we have on benchmarking. So I'll link that one up. So that's tip number one, or step one in the process. Make sure you are, or the person that you're helping is testing on a realistic data set. Use as many parameters as possible. I've hinted at that already. Mentioned analyze and buffers, but there are also parameters for settings, which tells you any non-default planner related settings that you have. So for example, if you've changed work mem or random page cost, these are common ones to have changed. Those will show up. But also if you've, for example, been testing a few locally and you've forgotten that you've still got those set, they'll show up in your explain plan as well, which can be helpful. Another important one another one that I find really useful is verbose, especially when helping other people. You get to see information about the schema, for example. You get fully qualified object names. You also get the output of each operation in the query execution plan, what data it's sending to its parent operation, which can be useful for advising certain optimizations. A couple of others. A new one is the write-ahead logging information, or I say new, I think it was a few versions old now. You can also specify different formats. So JSON format's particularly popular these days amongst tools, but text format is generally still the most concise and most readable amongst, especially people that are most familiar with it. They'll often ask to see the text format plan because it's smaller and more familiar to them. Now, there are a couple of other parameters as well, less important because people generally leave them on or leave the defaults in place, but timing can be really useful if you want to, for example, turn timing information off but have analyze on. So you still get the full execution timing statistics, but you don't measure the per node timing, which is where the main overhead is. So I've seen some tool vendors recommend turning that off with auto explain, but worth measuring if it does actually have any overhead on your system before doing so, because timing information could be really useful when looking at speeding things up. Costs you can turn off as well. The only time I've seen that done, and the only time I've done it myself, is when writing blog posts or sharing query plans where I just want to make them slightly less intimidating or draw attention to the more important parts. So those are on by default. And the other one that's on by default is, or at least when you use explain analyze, is summary, which puts the information at the end, so like planning timings and execution timings, which are very useful. So generally people don't turn that off, but it means you can turn that on, for example, with explain, which gives you the planning time. Because remember, when we just do explain, we only plan the query. Postgres doesn't execute that. So you can get the planning time just from explain alone if you use the summary parameter. But generally, I recommend putting as many of those on as you can, especially if you're using a tool to parse it, or if you are getting help from others. The more information, the better for them. Cool. So that's the second step. The third one is glance at the end. So query plans, especially once your queries get a bit more complex, can get quite long. You can get feel a bit like a wall of text. But a few of the probably rarer problems, to be honest, but a few of the fairly common problems are highlighted very much at the end. So things like if your planning time is 10x your execution time, there's very little point looking through the rest of the query plan, looking for optimization potential, because the vast majority of your of the total time was in planning. So that's only reported at the end, and the rest of the query plan won't help you. The other two things that are reported at the end that also report a total time are triggers. So trigger executions, they can be the performance issue. If you have triggers involved, there's going to be some overhead there. They report a total time. If that's a high percentage of your total execution time, you found your problem already without looking through the whole execution plan. Same is true for just-in-time compilation. That can, in certain cases, be 99% of execution time, which, again, makes looking through the query plan not as useful. Cool. So that's the third one. Fourth is then, once you've looked at those, then figure out, okay, we do need to look at the rest of the query plan. Where is the time going? Like, which parts of these are the most expensive? Or if you have buffers on, which of these scans is doing the most reads? The reason I mention that that's like step 4 is because I think it's very easy at this point to jump to look into other issues. And I've been guilty of this in the past myself as well. So experienced people, I think, maybe are even more susceptible to this than less experienced people. If you notice a sequential scan, your eye gets drawn to it immediately, and you think, oh, maybe there's an issue there, or you notice a large filter, or a few thousand rows being filtered, or a lot of loops or something. If your eye gets drawn to these problems that you're used to looking for, you can get tripped up, or you can end up going down a bit of a rabbit hole on this. So my tip is to really check where the timings go, like which of these is really taking up the most time, and then focus your attention there. Only once you've worked that out, focus on that part of the query, or that part of the query plan. Is there a bottleneck we can solve? And maybe we'll come back to the other issue we spotted later, but the query might be fast enough by that point and we can move on. So yeah, that's the fourth and fifth. So work out what the most expensive parts of the query plan are, and only then what you can do about it. So on the timings front, there are a few things to be aware of. So the execution time is reported inclusive of, one operation's execution time is inclusive of all of its children. So a little bit of subtraction you'd think might be enough there to work out maybe which of the operations is the most expensive on its own. But you have to take into account a bunch of other things as well. So those execution times are a per loop average. So for example, if one of our operations is being looped over multiple times, which is especially common in join operations, but also parallel execution utilizes loops as how it reports. So there's a few ways where we have to then multiply it by the number of loops before subtracting from the parent operation. So these things you can see how they can start to get a little bit complex. In addition, Postgres reports these timings in milliseconds and doesn't include thousand separators. So I know I personally can start to struggle with the arithmetic of all that once it starts getting into the multiple seconds. As such, there's a ton of tools that can help you with this. I work on one, but there are some really good free open source ones available. Lots of editors include them by default, and pretty much all of them make at least some effort to get those timings pretty good. So some popular ones are depeche.explain.com. A really nice thing about that is that it preserves the text format, so it's really expert friendly. If you want to share an explain plan with the Postgres mailing lists, the one they'll be most familiar with and most comfortable with will be the explain.depeche one. But explain.dalabo.com is really popular these days, much more visual, includes more charts on, for example, where the timings are going, where the buffers, like which operations do the most buffer hits, that kind of thing. Much more beginner friendly, and as I would probably class my tool as well, pgmustard, visual as well, but also helps with that next step a bit more on what you can possibly do about things. But yeah, so the main reason I want to mention those is they can really help on the timings front. So you can paste your query plan in and quickly see where the timings are going. I would say that a lot of them don't do that step 3. So a lot of them don't immediately draw your attention if there's triggers taking up a lot of time, or just-in-time compilation taking up a lot of time, or even planning time. So it is still worth doing that step first, and then checking out a tool or two that you're familiar with for the next steps. Yeah, that's pretty much it for a process. Obviously, that 5th step, working out what to do next, is a hugely deep topic, and it's actually where a lot of the normal talks on Explain, if you go to a conference and see a talk on Explain, that's normally where they'll pick up. So the best one I've seen is a bit old now. It's from probably about 2016, but Josh Berkus gave it a few times, but I'll share one of the recordings that I liked a lot. He spends about an hour going through a lot of the different join types, scan types of issues you can see, things to be aware of. And yeah, it's a lot. Even then, probably only covers the first 10% of what you could know. There are more recent talks, one by Bruce Monjan, actually, who covered some of the rarer scan types. So I'll link that one up as well. But this is a deep, deep topic that you can dive into. I'm a few years in, and I don't consider myself an expert yet. So that gives you an idea. But yeah, it's extremely powerful tool for query optimization in general. Naturally, to speed things up, it really helps to know which part's slow. So please use it. Let me know how you get on. It'd be cool to hear. We've done a bunch of related episodes. So a couple of those to check out are, there's an extension called Auto Explain. Now that will let you run your queries as normal, let's say, or maybe even on production, and the users get the results of the query back, which we don't when we run Explain. I don't know if I mentioned that up top, but the people using your database will continue to run their queries and get their results as usual. But in the background, the execution plans will be being logged. Any that are beyond a certain timing threshold that you set will get logged to your Postgres logs. So we've done a whole episode on that, can be extremely useful, and I'll link that up. We've also done one on row estimates. So that's another common issue. So with Explain, we get to see how many rows Postgres expected to be returned at each stage. And when it's wrong by a lot especially, that can lead to all sorts of issues with inefficient plans being chosen. So we did a whole episode on that. In fact, our first ever episode was on slow queries and slow transactions, so that's worth checking out if you haven't already. And we did a more advanced one on query optimization, which, again, we still didn't cover some of the basics of explaining. So I'm glad to have done this one now. Welcome any questions, and please do remember to send your guest and topic suggestions through. Happy holidays. Hope you all had a good one, and catch you next time, hopefully with a guest. All right, bye.